Modern Berlin is a unified metropolis. Traffic flows continuously across the Spree River, train lines connect every district, and the city hums with unbroken energy. But for 28 years, a concrete barrier sliced right through this urban center, turning one city into two entirely different worlds. To understand how a city gets cut in half, we have to look back to 1945. Following the surrender of Nazi Germany, the victorious Allied leaders, Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, divided the defeated nation. They split Germany into four distinct occupation zones, administered by the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. This map shows the borders drawn at those conferences. Notice the location of Berlin. The capital itself was divided into four sectors, but the entire city sat deep inside the Soviet occupation zone. This created a strange geopolitical reality. West Berlin became an isolated enclave of capitalism, entirely surrounded by communist territory. The tension over this isolated city flared almost immediately. In 1948, the Soviet Union cut off all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, trying to starve the Allies out. The response was a massive 15-month logistical operation. Transport planes landed on West Berlin runways every 90 seconds, delivering over 2 million tons of food and coal from the air. The blockade was lifted, but the friction remained. Over the next decade, a stark contrast emerged. West Berlin rebuilt its economy with aid and access to Western markets, while East Germany struggled to keep pace. Facing poor living conditions and strict political control, millions of East Germans packed their bags and walked into West Berlin to seek better pay and greater personal freedom. By the summer of 1961, thousands of citizens were fleeing every single week. Many of them were young, skilled professionals. This relentless mass departure threatened the East German state with total economic collapse, turning an ongoing political dispute into an immediate crisis of survival for the regime. The East German leadership panicked. Under the cover of darkness on August 12, 1961, the army and police forces moved in. By morning, they had unspooled miles of barbed wire straight through the center of Berlin, tearing up streets and sealing off the border overnight. That makeshift wire quickly gave way to cinder blocks and mortar. The state erected a permanent, fortified concrete structure that instantly severed transit lines and separated families. Parents, children, and friends who lived just streets away from each other were suddenly cut off completely. The desperation to escape the closing border was immediate. 3 days after the barrier went up, a 19-year-old East German guard named Konrad Schumann was standing watch. In the middle of the afternoon, he dropped his cigarette, took a running start, and leapt over a low coil of barbed wire into the west. With the border sealed, the ideological clash of the Cold War crystallized into physical architecture. Half of the city was now effectively locked in, and the initial chaotic barricades were about to evolve into a heavily militarized border system. Over the following decades, the East German government expanded the barrier into a lethal obstacle course. The wall itself was actually two concrete barriers separated by a wide expanse known as the death strip. This space was engineered to trap escapees, featuring anti-vehicle trenches, hundreds of watchtowers, guard dog runs, and tripwire machine guns. The division reached even below ground. West Berlin subway lines physically ran under East Berlin territory. Trains would slow to a crawl as they passed through dimly lit, heavily patrolled platforms, where no one was allowed to board or exit. Berliners called them Eisterbahnhöfe, or ghost stations. Above ground, the physical border was reinforced by an invisible one. The Ministry for State Security, known as the Stasi, operated out of a massive office complex in East Berlin. They served as the psychological extension of the wall, ensuring that the control exerted at the border penetrated into everyday life. By the late 1980s, the Stasi employed around 91,000 full-time workers and managed a network of at least 170,000 unofficial informants. Neighbors, colleagues, and even family members routinely reported on one another. This was the stark bargain of the regime. The state guaranteed housing, employment, and childcare, but extracted absolute political compliance in return. Citizens lived under constant watch, strictly forbidden from traveling beyond the concrete limits of the Eastern Bloc. Despite the intense security, people continuously tried to find a way out. Over 28 years, more than 5,000 individuals successfully escaped the east. They tunneled under the border, flew over in hot air balloons, and crawled through sewers. In response, authorities aggressively bricked up basement windows and doorways facing the west. For at least 140 people, the attempt ended in death. By the late 1980s, the East German state was quietly fracturing from within. The economy was heavily reliant on external debt and could not compete in the global market. Furthermore, aging industrial infrastructure had severely polluted the country's rivers and air, fueling widespread public dissatisfaction. The ultimate safety net for the East German government had always been the Soviet military. But when Mikhail Gorbachev assumed leadership of the Soviet Union, he implemented a policy of restructuring known as perestroika. He made it clear that Soviet troops would no longer intervene to suppress domestic uprisings in neighboring Eastern Bloc countries. The final catalyst came from outside Germany. In the summer of 1989, Hungary dismantled its border fence with Austria. This opened a massive loophole in the Iron Curtain. East Germans realized they could simply travel south to Hungary and cross the newly opened border into Western Europe, completely bypassing the Berlin Wall. Hundreds of thousands of East Germans took the route through Hungary. Back home, hundreds of thousands more took to the streets in weekly demonstrations, demanding free elections and the right to travel. With the economy bankrupt and the threat of Soviet intervention gone, the pressure on the ruling party reached a breaking point. On November 9, 1989, the East German leadership attempted to regain control. They drafted a set of new travel regulations, intending to allow citizens to apply for visas to leave the country permanently. The rules were highly conditional, designed simply to vent the mounting public anger. That evening, party official Günter Schabowski sat before a crowded room of international journalists. He had been handed the draft of the new regulations just before the press conference began, and had not been fully briefed on the details or the timeline for implementation. This transcript captures the critical error. Asked when the new rules would take effect, Schabowski shuffled his notes, visibly confused. Missing the instructions delaying implementation, he simply read a line off the page, telling the press the borders were open, immediately, without delay. That single, uncoordinated sentence was broadcast live across East and West Germany. Within minutes, thousands of East Berliners left their homes and marched toward the heavily fortified checkpoints, demanding to cross. The border guards, heavily armed, but completely lacking orders to shoot the massive crowds, found their authority erased by a bureaucratic mistake. The numbers swelled at the gates. The guards made frantic calls to their superiors, but the central command structure had effectively collapsed. At 11:30 p.m., facing overwhelming crowds and lacking clear directives, the commanding officer finally relented and lifted the barriers. The floodgates opened. Jubilant East Berliners streamed into the West unhindered, greeted by cheering West Berliners on the other side. Crowds converged on the Brandenburg Gate, climbing to the top of the concrete barrier, dancing together, and using household hammers to physically chip away at the structure that had imprisoned half their city. The sudden, accidental opening of the border accelerated the total collapse of the East German state. The ruling party lost power, the Stasi was dissolved, and free elections were held. Less than a year later, on October 3, 1990, East and West Germany were officially reunified. Today, the most heavily fortified border in Europe exists primarily as scattered, graffiti-covered concrete slabs. The guard towers and minefields are gone, replaced by memorials, museums, and colorful murals painted directly onto the surviving ruins. The removal of the wall proved that collective human action can dismantle even the most entrenched physical borders. But as thousands gathered under the floodlights in November 1989, it remains an open question if anyone in the crowd truly believed that an entire political empire could be brought down in a single night.